Hi, I'm Bruce Baker. I want to share with you something that I'm doing that I think very few other people are doing. Um, I live in Michigan, and while we have access to some pretty spectacular trees in northern Michigan, there are certain things that we don't have. And one of them is a native species that typically exhibits lots of dead wood. I'm fascinated by dead wood in bonsai, and it was the contrast between living in dead wood that really got me interested in bonsai in the first place. In fact, I think one of the first bonsai I ever saw was a California juniper at Longwood Botanical Gardens. That was it was mostly dead wood, and although I'd been observing trees my whole life, I never really thought much about it, and I never really realized that it's the interior of the tree is dead, and all the life is on the outside of the tree. So um, that thought and an exploration of bonsai got me going. I got started in the 70s. Um, One of the first people I met along the way was Dan Robinson, and I should dedicate this video to Dan. He's an amazing and one of a kind bonsai artist from Bremerton, Washington, and he actually taught me how to carve. Now, it didn't take very long. Um, we didn't spend a tremendous amount of time carving together, but I did watch him carve. He showed me some of the things that he was doing, and more importantly, he spoke to me about his philosophy. And his philosophy was that you should do it. Um, don't let anything hold you back, and especially not yourself. So I got started, like most people did, with small bonsai, maybe with some of the things you get from bonsai nurseries. I went over to Home Depot and Frank's Nursery and places like that. I dug up trees in the wild that I could find. They were all kind of tiny trees. But more and more, it really bothered me that what I wanted to do was to work on trees with beautiful dead wood, and I couldn't buy that. I couldn't find it, and so it struck me. Well, I live in a 100-year-old neighborhood, and as I walk around the neighborhood, and I think other people who maybe live in similar urban environments might find the same thing. I noticed a lot of old junipers and yews. Now, uh, the junipers are beautiful. They're spectacular. The varieties that we have in the United States growing in landscape are nothing to write home about. But the yews are something else, especially the yews that were planted as foundation plantings in old neighborhoods, let's say before 1930 or so. And I say 1930 because I believe that in that about in that time frame, the production of yews commercially changed, and the species changed. Now, pretty much everything that you can buy, unless you buy from a specialty nursery, is something called Taxus exumatia. It's a less desirable hybrid of Taxus cuspidata. More importantly, they're typically cut right at the base, and so you have lots of smaller stems. The idea is producing a landscape serviceable plant very quickly. Um, so this tree would have been planted as a foundation planting in about 1900. So right away, it's over 120 years old, and in fact, it was probably 5 or 10 years old when it was planted. Like almost all yews, and in fact, like almost all landscape in the United States, this tree was very badly neglected. Um, it was a planting in front of a relatively small house, and yet what you're looking at is only maybe one half, maybe one half of the height of the original tree. Um, it wasn't pruned properly. It had grown wild, multiple stems. But I got to know this plant over the decades. Walking by it, it was a woman named Irene Brockholm owned the home, and eventually a woman named Sue Lawrence, a good friend of ours, ended up inheriting the home from Irene. And about 12 years ago, Sue was kind enough to allow me to begin the process of turning this into a bonsai. So the first step, a dozen years ago, was to cut this huge landscape plant back in the ground, and I cut it very severely. It may not look like it now, but I cut it to the point where there was very little living foliage on it. Of course, it flushed out pretty quickly. Yews will not bud back if there are no green twigs, no living needles. But there were on this plant. There were some internally, and so I cut it back about 12 years ago. About 10 years ago, I was able to dig the tree, and when I say dig, it's almost ridiculous to say that I dug it, because I started with shovels. I started with shovels and saws and axes and hatchets and all the normal tools you would use to dig up a tree. But a tree this size with a trunk that's bigger around than my waist has roots that are as big around as my legs. So there was really no way I could cut the thing, not by hand. So that effort was aborted. And then the next idea I got from a good friend of mine, was to go out and rent a bobcat. And so I did. I rented a bobcat and brought it back into the neighborhood, and I tried to pry this thing out of the ground. I tried and tried, and I actually broke the bobcat. The rental agency told me it was the only time they had ever seen a bobcat that was broken. I actually bent the front of the frame, and if you can imagine that. So finally I called my buddy Mark Underwood, who is every bit as much of a maniac as I am. And Mark explained to me that the way to get a tree like this out of the ground was to go out and hire a tow truck. But not just any tow truck. He said go out and hire the biggest tow truck that you can find. Hire the tow truck that they use to pull semis out of ditches. So I went to my local Sackstrup's Towing in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I said, I need the biggest tow truck that you have. And they said, well, why would you need the biggest tow truck we have? What you got a truck in a ditch? And I said, no, it's just trust me on this. If you could give me the tow truck, we'll do what I need to do. So he said, well, what is it? I said, okay, I want to take a shrub out of the ground. And he said, I said, how much is that going to be? He said, $50. So I went back home. It turns out we lived just a couple of houses down from where this tree came from. And a gentleman showed up with a tow truck. And the tow truck was so big it could barely drive down our street. We hooked up a winch to the base of the tree, and we started to pull, and the winch, the cable got tighter and tighter, and actually the front of the truck started to lift up a little bit. We were afraid we were going to break it, so we had to stop and make a long story a little bit longer. We spent more than half a day with various tools, chopping through some of the roots underneath and filling the hole with water to kind of try to loosen up the soil. And finally, in the end, we were able to pull the tree out of the ground. So this was 10 years ago, and I was able to get it into my backyard. I moved it into the backyard actually with a manual piano mover. And then it sat in the ground for a couple of years. After I was confident that it had survived that operation, and by the way, one of the things that makes these yews collectible, and I would really, anybody who's watching this and kind of getting excited about it and thinking about a yew that they know of, it's almost always the case. I've dug up maybe more than a dozen, maybe close to 2 dozen yews now. It's almost always the case that there are very small feeder roots right at the base of the tree. I don't know why that is, but they sprout readily out of the larger roots, and that's all you need to keep the tree alive. So after a couple of years, I popped it out of the ground. I got it into a growing bed. And when I say pop it out of the ground, this weighs about 350 pounds. So it required a lot of levering and all sorts of machinations to get it into a raised bed, where it spent another couple years. And then I believe it was maybe 2.5 years ago that I was very lucky to be given a gift pot by Carmen Leskoviansky from the University of Michigan's Mathi Botanical Gardens. This pot is big enough for this tree. It's the only pot I've ever seen that would actually fit this tree in the United States. And so I, after chainsawing off lots of huge roots and really cramming the thing in, I got it into a bonsai pot where it's now spent the last, say, 2.5 years. And so here we are, a dozen years out, and I still haven't actually styled it as a bonsai. All I've done is work on the deadwood. And that's what I want to talk about. The rest of this is just is interesting, but what I want to talk about is carving deadwood. Why, how, what you do, all of these kinds of things. And so here we go. First of all, this tree, there was no deadwood on it. It was all alive. Multiple stems coming out from the base. You can see what's going on down in this lower area, all these shapes, and I'll talk about how I got there. But typically anything that's rounded like this, anything with the curved hollow at the base of this tree is actually, it was there. It was part of the tree. It was a real collar around a branch. So for example, right here, there was a huge branch coming out in this direction. So when you get a tree like this out of the ground and it's all alive, there's no deadwood on it at all. You've got your fine roots, you plant it into a planter box or whatever you do with it. You have to wait. And part of that more than a decade that I've waited to actually style this tree, what happens is the vascular system finds the branches that it's able to feed, and it sloughs off everything else. Areas of the tree will die. So most of what you see now as deadwood was alive. Well, it was all alive. Most of it died back on its own. Now, the only way to discover that was to carefully examine the bark and to check for the living tissue. But what typically happens with yews is, over time, they die back. They will form very distinctive vascular lines. Now, this is a small one, and I think this one might disappear over time. Most of the living part of this tree is on this side of the tree, and there's a very wide band of living bark here. So that's the first thing. So what do you do when you have a tree that is huge, or even if it's not huge, even if it's just a small tree, what do you do to make it look right? And so over time I kind of developed an approach, and the approach is really to attempt to reveal what's already there. Two parts: reveal and enhance, and let's say even exaggerate. And the reason is that what we're doing is, when we carve, you might carve a tree that already has a deadwood. You might get a California juniper that's got beautiful deadwood, but it's got one area that looks terrible. So you might go in and just kind of clean that up and attempt to make it blend with the rest of the tree so nobody knows there was any carving done. The problem with these is any deadwood is going to be carve to. It's either going to be perfectly round and look like nothing, or it's going to be wood that you carved. So what I attempt to do is to discover what's already in the tree. Now that's going to sound crazy maybe to some people. Some people may immediately understand it. There are two ways to discover. One of them is through observation, through with your eyes. And with my eyes, I noticed the whole beginning of the styling of the whole beginning of the carving of this tree was actually right up in this area of this branch. And what I noticed was, I noticed some indentations. I followed them, and I almost got a little bit of a barber pole kind of a feeling and so I thought, well, you know, there's a little bit of a spiral there. Let's run with this. Let's see what we can do. And then in the lower area, as I said, we had all of these trunks that I knew I had to remove, and I couldn't see just cutting them off flat. So around every major trunk or branch, there is this tissue at the collar, and it's special tissue. It's extra hard, and in fact, mentioning hardness brings me to my second way of discovering what's in the tree, and that's through your fingers, the sensation. When you're using a high-speed carving tool, you can actually feel what the areas of wood that are harder versus softer. And I'll just throw out a general rule right now. If you have a high-speed carving tool and you're moving through wood and you find a soft area, my recommendation is explore that, get rid of it, and you may reveal some kind of structure inside the tree that was already there and is actually beautiful. So so that's the second way. First way is observation. The second way is tactile discovery, and then another way, which is also observation, but it's a little different than what I was talking about previously, and that is paint by numbers. Every tree has growth rings, and inside of an old yew, as you're carving, you can see these growth rings. And a tree that has grown over 100 years is going to have interesting things going on in those rings. You're gonna see movement inside the trunk. You can't understand exactly why it's there. You might have a section of round trunk like this, but inside you might see some wavy movement in the lines of the growth rings. So follow the lines. It's like paint by numbers. So those are the three basic ways. You can only learn to carve by carving. It's not something that I suppose people teach how to carve, but it's for anyone who's not actually doing it, it's incredibly boring. There's almost nothing more boring than carving. But when you're doing it yourself, there's a certain mindfulness. It's almost like Zen, and it's immensely rewarding. It's especially rewarding when you get to the stage where you feel confident that you can actually bring out the best features in the tree. So, so I'll talk about this. I'll talk about this a little bit. Starting with the base, I mentioned that all of these sort of circular hollow areas, if you were here and able to take a close look at the tree, maybe you will be able to take a close look at this tree one day, you'll find a series of concentric rings in the center, meaning that there was a branch there, and I've removed all traces of the branch except for the collar tissue. And then I ran with the collars, and I came up with this, and it's a process that I've described a little bit like, you know, you might see a bird in the distance if you're a birder, and you've got binoculars, but they're not in focus, so you don't know what the bird is. You look at it and you start focusing, and as you get closer and closer, eventually you see the bird. It's the same thing with bonsai. in the beginning, you're not really sure where you're going. You have to focus on process. And if you follow the process, if you're careful and if you're diligent, you will begin to see the bird or the bonsai come into focus. And so that's a major consideration for me, is when I start with a tree, what value is there in the tree? Well, in this case, obviously, the tree is big. That's not really a value. In fact, it's more of a pain than anything else. But it has very obvious taper. It's got a wide base. It tapered into, well, there was one trunk that was much larger than the others, and there's movement. And so that's, I started here. After beginning this process, I spent probably a year jumping back and forth between this area and this area, just working a couple of hours at a time, 2-3 hours, and returning to the same spots over and over again, following what I felt, what I saw, not attempting to impose my own ideas, although that does happen along the way, but just trying to explore the tree and enhance what was already there, turn the dead wood parts into something worth seeing, which is probably exaggeration. If you think about it, think about the best juniper bonsai you've ever seen. Now think about that dead wood, and then just imagine some bonsai artist making it. Well, it kind of defies logic that you would get some of the shapes that you get, but they are natural shapes in these collected junipers, and so you need to suspend your disbelief just a little bit to appreciate the trees. So the base, I'm pleased with the way that it sort of flows up into this area. It's kind of hard to see. Once I open this up and style it, it'll be a lot more apparent what's going on. But so this area, I actually more or less completed it before I completed other areas of the tree, and I spent quite a bit of time in here. There was a major branch coming off in this direction, and this is another major branch. They're sort of branching like this, and I had to remove a lot of wood in this area just to make sense of it. You do have to, even with a dead wood tree, even with something that is crazy wild driftwood, you still have to observe conventions like reducing the mass as you move upward. You can call it taper, you can call it internal taper, or you can just say there's less and less mass the higher and higher I get in the tree. And that's just because that's the natural way trees look. So this was a really fun area for me to work on. In the beginning, it was another branch, and there was foliage way out here somewhere, and I thought, well, maybe the tree will move in this direction. But more and more I realized I wanted to keep the focus of the bonsai on the most interesting part of the dead wood, right up through the center of the tree. So I killed this, and I was very pleased to turn sort of a collection of sort of a sprout of different branches right here and another one here, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of a dragon's head, and I played with it, and it wasn't 100% discovery in this area. Part of it was me imposing my own ideas. So the end result, when you do this kind of work this way, is, first of all, you have a piece of you have a bonsai that could never have existed before without your own efforts. That's exciting to me. It's something. It's some consolation for not having California junipers growing in the wild here. But another aspect of this type of design is that I actually think that there are styles of bonsai carving now. I've been able to get out, and I had a long absence from bonsai, and I've been able to get back into it, and I've met some incredible wood carvers, and I've seen some really great stuff. Um, there's in my approach, because of the way I do things, I'm not going to be doing a lot of really small detail work. I'm going to be focusing on the structure, the structural aspects of the wood. And so that tends to be more flowing lines and less detail in the carving. Now I know from the vantage point of your screen, it may look like there's a lot of detail here, but what I've seen recently is I've seen some amazing work where people will take wood that is dead and instantly make it look very old, and instantly bring out very small striations and actually almost give it a new pattern of growth. And I've seen some very fine work that way. I know my friend and idol Dan Robinson. He has a way that he approaches his trees, and he's seen some things in nature that he is replicating in his trees, and he does an amazing job of it. I think you can, if you saw a Dan Robinson tree and you were familiar with his carving, I think you would know that it was him. Likewise, there's a gentleman that I just recently met, a wonderful guy, Will Badley in the UK, and Will does just tremendous carving. While I don't know if there's a Will Badley style, what I do know is that he's focusing often on very small details that immediately make a very impressive bonsai. I like to wait. Once I've established the structure of the tree, what I've found is that after a few years, the growth rings tend to kind of split apart. Fissures show up in the wood. Wood tends to just sort of disappear. It gets evaporated by the sunlight and the water and other things, and it takes on a brand new character. It takes on a very old character. So this tree, I expect it will look pretty radically different in even 5 years. As time ages the exposed dead wood, you'll see the actual growth rings. You'll see the lines in the tree. They'll begin to split apart, and then I'll go in over time, and those lines that volunteer, I will enhance those. And I like that way of doing it. I think that it produces a pretty exciting plant, and so that's how I do it. And I'm going to talk more about this tree. In fact, this is the first of probably 2 or 3 videos I'm going to do. I need to style the tree. Now, this is not styled as a bonsai in any way. I've barely pruned the growth. So this is what you see after 12 years of growth, and I'm lucky that it turned out this way, because I think I've got a good shot at a really nice bonsai. But that's it. And if you're curious about this, feel free to contact me. I'm very easy to find. If you look up Bruce Baker, you'll find me on Facebook. You'll find me on Instagram. You can email me. I'll try to respond. Anyway, thank you for your time. Especially thank you if you got to this part of the video and saw the very end.